Welcome to Marple Whispers. I'm Sean, your companion in secrets and suspicion. Here, the softest whisper can unravel the darkest crime. Are you listening closely? Good. Then let the mystery begin. In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hide behind lace curtains, a wealthy banker drops dead after a simple haddock supper, marked by St. Peter's thumb, a supposed blessing turned deadly curse. Was it food poisoning or madness, as his wild ravings suggest? Enter Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed spinster with a knack for unraveling human deceit. As whispers of jealousy and betrayal swirl, she uncovers a chilling plot. His elegant wife, Eliza, poisoned him with pilocarpine from his eye drops, staging it as suicide to claim his fortune and escape with her lover. But Marple's quiet genius exposes every twist: convulsions masked as delirium, a niece's trembling innocence, and a garden hiding fatal clues. Stay hooked. The real killer's confession will shock you. Chapter 1. The Village Whisper. The drowsy charm of St. Mary Mead enveloped the village like a well-worn shawl, its cottages huddled together under roofs of weathered thatch, secrets nestled in every shadowed nook. It was late afternoon, the kind where sunlight lingered lazily on hedgerows bursting with wildflowers, and the air hummed with the distant chime of the church bell marking the hour. In her cozy sitting room at Danemead Cottage, Miss Jane Marple perched on the edge of her armchair, her knitting a flurry of pink wool that masked the keen workings of her mind. She had just unraveled a particularly stubborn knot when the door flew open with the force of a sudden gale. It was Dolly Bantry, her bosom heaving, as if she'd dashed from Gossington Hall without pausing for breath, her wide-brimmed hat tilted at a rakish angle that spoke of haste rather than fashion. Jane Marple, you sly old thing, sitting here like the Oracle of Delphi, while the village is ablaze with the most shocking news. Reginald Hargreaves, dead. And not just dead, but in a way that's got tongues wagging from the post office to the vicarage. Food poisoning, they claim. But oh, the details. It's positively lurid. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and unblinking behind her spectacles, fixed on her friend with the intensity of a detective sizing up a suspect. She gestured to the chintz sofa, her voice as calm as a mill pond. "Dolly, my dear, you look quite flushed. Sit down before you expire yourself. A cup of tea? Now, start from the beginning. What manner of tragedy has befallen poor Mr. Hargreaves?" Dolly collapsed onto the cushions, fanning herself with a gloved hand, her words tumbling out like spilled pearls. "It was last evening, at Elmhurst. Reginald dined alone with Eliza. Haddock, fresh from the fishmonger's van, marked with that eerie black thumbprint. You know, the one the old sailors swear is St. Peter's own touch. A sign of good luck, they say, but luck turned sour this time. By midnight, the house was in uproar, screams echoing through the halls, Reginald thrashing about in his bed, his face contorted like something out of a nightmare. Dr. Haydock rushed over, but it was too late. Convulsions, foaming at the lips, and, here's the spine-tingler, he was babbling madness, wild accusations of treachery, shadows lurking in his mind, as if some inner demon had clawed its way out. Miss Marple poured the tea with deliberate precision, her thoughts racing ahead like a fox evading the hounds. Food poisoning from haddock? Common enough in summer, yet the symptoms Dolly described hinted at something sharper, more insidious. Perhaps a toxin that mimicked delirium to deflect suspicion. She recalled a long-ago scandal in the neighboring parish, where a husband's fit of madness proved to be belladonna slipped into his port by a desperate wife. "How dreadful," she murmured, handing over the cup. "And Eliza? She must be devastated. Such a poised woman, always so elegant at the garden parties." Dolly leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that could still carry across the room. "Poised? Ha! That's what makes it all so intriguing. She's holding up remarkably well. Too well, if you ask me. The servants are whispering that Reginald had been odd lately, pacing the grounds at dusk, muttering about lost fortunes and hidden betrayals. And Eliza's jaunts to London? More frequent than ever. Mrs. Price, at the shop, swears she saw Eliza posting a letter to a Mr. F., could be Forbes, that suave solicitor from town. Jealousy, Jane. It's the oldest motive in the book. What if Reginald uncovered some dalliance, enough to drive a man to the edge or over it? The old lady's fingers itched to resume knitting, but she resisted, her gaze drifting to the window where the village green lay serene, belying the undercurrents of intrigue. Insanity rumors. How artfully they spread, like ink in water, obscuring the truth. She thought of young Tommy Pierce, the butcher's boy, who once feigned a seizure to avoid a scolding. Deceptions were as common as daisies in these parts. "Rumors can be deceptive, Dolly," she said mildly. "Like mist on the moor, they hide the path. Who else was present that fateful night? The niece, Lydia Trent, I suppose, such a withdrawn girl, always buried in her nursing books." Dolly's eyes gleamed with fresh relish. "Lydia, yes. She's been tending to Reginald's ailments, glaucoma, headaches, the lot. And Mrs. Cook, the cook, who's as superstitious as a medieval witch. She blessed the haddock thrice before serving it, invoking saint. Peter himself. But Tom, the under-gardener, overheard Eliza insisting on that very dish, even though Reginald had complained of indigestion. Coincidence? Or calculation? Oh, Jane, it's got all the makings of a thriller. The isolated house, the devoted wife with secrets, the ominous omen of the thumb mark. If this isn't foul play dressed up as accident, I'll eat my hat." As Dolly prattled on, enumerating the villagers' wild theories, from cursed fish to a family curse, Miss Marple's mind sharpened like a blade on a whetstone. The thumb mark of St. Peter, a pious legend or a clever misdirection. Convulsions could stem from ptomaine, but paired with ravings? That screamed of something pharmaceutical, perhaps pilocarpine from those eye drops, overdosed to simulate madness and mask murder. Motives swirled. Inheritance, infidelity, escape from a tyrannical spouse. St. Mary Mead might seem sleepy, but beneath its placid surface lurked passions as deadly as any in the great cities. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her curiosity fully aroused. This whisper in the village was the prelude to a storm, and she would be the one to trace its eye. Chapter 2. The House of Secrets. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead, like a conspirator reluctant to depart, shrouding the village in a veil that seemed to whisper of hidden truths. Miss Jane Marple, her black felt hat firmly pinned, and her umbrella serving more as a prop than a necessity, made her way along the winding lane to Elmhurst, the Hargreaves' imposing residence. The house stood at the village's edge, its gabled roof and ivy-clad walls exuding an air of prosperous seclusion, as if it held its secrets as tightly as a miser clutches his gold. The tragedy of Reginald Hargreaves' death had stirred the village into a frenzy of speculation, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human frailty, had accepted Eliza Hargreaves's invitation to call with a mixture of curiosity and quiet resolve. As she approached the wrought-iron gates, she noted the manicured precision of the grounds, rose beds trimmed with military neatness, gravel paths raked to perfection, and a single yew tree standing sentinel by the front door, its dark foliage a somber contrast to the riot of summer blooms. The scene was almost too perfect, she thought, like a stage set for a drama where every prop concealed a clue. Her knock was answered by a maid, a nervous girl with red-rimmed eyes, who ushered her into a hall adorned with heavy oak paneling and a portrait of a stern-faced Hargreaves ancestor glaring down as if judging the present calamity. Eliza Hargreaves awaited in the drawing-room, a vision of composed widowhood in a black silk dress that accentuated her still youthful figure. At 45, she carried the poise of a woman accustomed to admiration, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon, her green eyes sharp yet shadowed, with something Miss Marple could not quite place. Grief, perhaps, or calculation. "Miss Marple," Eliza said, rising with a smile that was both gracious and guarded, "how kind of you to come. The village has been so good to us in this terrible time." "My dear Mrs. Hargreaves," Miss Marple replied, settling into a plush armchair with a view of the garden, "it is the least one can do. Such a shocking loss. I knew your husband only, slightly. Church fates, the occasional word at the post office. But he seemed a gentleman of great reserve." Eliza's lips tightened briefly, as if the description carried an unintended barb. "Reginald was private, yes. He preferred his books and his garden to society. But please, have some tea. Lydia will join us shortly. She's been quite shaken." The mention of Lydia Trent, Eliza's niece and companion, piqued Miss Marple's interest. The girl, barely 23, had a reputation for quiet diligence, her mousy demeanor and plain features making her a shadow in the Hargreaves orbit. Miss Marple recalled seeing her at the vicarage tea, hovering at the edges, her eyes darting as if perpetually expecting reproach. Was it timidity, or something deeper, a secret weighing on her conscience? As the maid poured tea, Miss Marple's gaze wandered the room. The drawing-room was a study in understated wealth, mahogany furniture polished to a mirror sheen, a crystal chandelier catching the morning light, and a bookshelf lined with volumes on history and theology. One book lay open on a side table, its pages yellowed but pristine. Legends of the Saints, turned to a chapter on St. Peter. The coincidence was striking, given the fatal haddock's thumb mark, and Miss Marple's fingers itched to examine it closer. "What a fascinating collection," she remarked, nodding toward the shelf. "Reginald was a scholar of sorts, I understand." Eliza followed her gaze, her expression unreadable. "Oh, yes. He loved old tales, saints, martyrs, that sort of thing. He found the thumb mark amusing, you know. Called it St. Peter's blessing over dinner that night. Such a grim irony now." Before Miss Marple could probe further, Lydia entered, her pale face almost translucent in the morning light. Her brown hair was pulled back severely, and her gray dress hung loosely, as if she wished to fade into the wallpaper. "Miss Marple," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry to keep you waiting. I was tidying Uncle's study." "No trouble at all, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly, noting the girl's trembling hands as she accepted a teacup. "You were very close to your uncle, I believe. It must be a dreadful shock." Lydia's eyes flicked to Eliza, then dropped to her lap. He was kind to me. I helped with his medicines. His eyes, you know. Glaucoma. The drops were important. Pilocarpine, I presume? Miss Marple's tone was light, almost casual, but her eyes were sharp as needles. Such a delicate treatment. One must be precise, I imagine. Eliza interjected smoothly. Lydia is quite trained, Miss Marple. She studied nursing before coming to us. Reginald trusted her implicitly. Lydia flushed, her fingers tightening on the cup. I tried to be careful. He was particular about the dosage. The conversation paused as the maid re-entered, setting down a plate of scones that no one touched. Miss Marple's mind was already turning over the details. Pilocarpine, a drug for glaucoma, could be lethal in excess, producing symptoms, salivation, convulsions, delirium, that might be mistaken for food poisoning or even madness. Had someone tampered with Reginald's drops? Eliza's composure suggested control, but Lydia's nervousness hinted at something unspoken. Was it guilt, fear, or merely the strain of grief? "Shall we take a turn in the garden?" Miss Marple suggested, sensing the room's atmosphere growing stifling. The roses are so lovely this time of year, and fresh air does wonders for clarity. Eliza hesitated, then agreed, leading the way through French doors to a terrace overlooking the grounds. The garden was a masterpiece of order, with neatly clipped hedges and a gravel path winding toward a small fountain. Miss Marple walked slowly, her umbrella tapping the ground, her eyes scanning for anything amiss. She noted a young gardener, Tom, weeding furiously near a bed of lavender, his cap pulled low as if to avoid scrutiny. "Your gardens are splendid," she said to Eliza. "Did Reginald spend much time here?" "He did, until his eyesight worsened," Eliza replied, her voice tinged with something like regret. Or was it rehearsal? "He loved the solitude. Lately, though, he'd been distracted. Business worries, I suppose." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Men do fret over such things. My nephew Raymond is forever fussing about investments, though I tell him worry never balanced a ledger." They paused by a rose bush, heavy with scarlet blooms, and Miss Marple bent to inspect a flower, her fingers brushing the petals. "These remind me of Mrs. Eldridge's garden. Such a scandal years ago when her roses were poisoned out of spite. Malice can hide in the most beautiful places, don't you think?" Eliza's smile faltered, and Lydia, trailing behind, stumbled slightly on the path. Miss Marple filed the reactions away, her mind circling back to the haddock supper. Dolly had mentioned Mrs. Cook's insistence on its freshness, yet Eliza's choice of the dish seemed deliberate. Had the thumb mark been a convenient distraction, a symbol to cloak a darker intent? As they returned to the house, Miss Marple lingered in the hall, her eyes catching a small detail. A wastebasket by the writing desk, containing a crumpled envelope with a London postmark. The handwriting was bold, masculine, and addressed to Eliza. "How tiresome, these stray papers," Miss Marple remarked, stooping as if to adjust her shoe. "One really must keep things tidy in such a fine house." Eliza's hand darted to the basket, retrieving the envelope with a forced laugh. "Just some old correspondence. I've been meaning to sort it." Miss Marple smiled benignly, but her mind was alight. The envelope bore the initials A.F., possibly Arthur Forbes, the solicitor Dolly had mentioned. A lover, a confidant, or merely a business associate? The intimacy of the handwriting suggested more than professional courtesy. Back in the drawing room, Miss Marple turned the conversation to the fatal night. It must have been dreadful for you, Mrs. Hargreaves, hearing your husband's distress. And you, Lydia, were you there when the doctor arrived?" Lydia's cup rattled in its saucer. I was in my room at first. I heard the screams and ran down. Uncle was unrecognizable, thrashing and shouting. He kept saying betrayed and shadows. I thought he was delirious from pain. Eliza's voice was steady. It was horrific. Dr. Haydock said it was likely ptomaine from the fish, though the haddock seemed perfect. Mrs. Cook is meticulous. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured, "though I recall a case in St. Honoré where a man died of what seemed food poisoning, only to discover it was a rare alkaloid in his medicine. The human body is so fragile, isn't it?" The room fell silent, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock. Eliza's eyes narrowed slightly, and Lydia's fingers twisted her handkerchief into knots. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her demeanor as placid as ever, but her thoughts were racing. The symptoms, convulsions, foaming, ravings, aligned disturbingly with pilocarpine overdose. Had Eliza, with her frequent London trips and composed facade, planned a murder to look like an accident? Or was Lydia, with her access to Reginald's drops, hiding a motive of her own? Debts, perhaps, or resentment at her uncle's control. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused by the bookshelf, her fingers brushing the open book on St. Peter. "Such a curious legend. The thumb mark," she said lightly. "A blessing, or so they say, though blessings can be misread, can't they? Like trust in the wrong hands." Eliza's smile was tight. Reginald found it quaint. He was always drawn to such stories. Lydia said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple took her leave, her umbrella tapping a thoughtful rhythm as she walked back to the village. The house of Elmhurst was a puzzle, its polished surfaces hiding cracks that only patience and observation could reveal. The thumb mark of St. Peter might be a fisherman's tale, but the mark of human deceit was far more tangible, and Miss Marple intended to trace it to its source. Back at Danemead, she settled into her armchair, her knitting resumed as a cover for her musings. The village would talk, of course, Dolly would see to that, but Miss Marple needed facts, not fancies. She thought of the envelope, the book, Lydia's trembling hands, and Eliza's unshakable calm. Human nature, she reflected, was like a garden, beautiful on the surface, but dig a little, and you found the worms. The question was, whose hand had sown the poison in Reginald Hargreaves's life? And why? Chapter 3. Whispers and Clues. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the village in hues of amber and rose, as if nature itself were conspiring to soften the sharp edges of the tragedy that had struck Elmhurst. The high street bustled with its usual rhythm, Mrs. Price at the general store arranging jars of boiled sweets, the postman whistling as he cycled past, and a gaggle of children darting through the churchyard. But beneath the surface, the village thrummed with a different energy. Whispers of Reginald Hargreaves' death slithered from cottage to cottage, each retelling embellished with a new flourish of suspicion or dread. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped over her shoulders and her straw hat adorned with a single velvet ribbon, walked purposefully toward the Blue Boar Inn, her umbrella tapping the cobblestones like a metronome, marking the beat of her thoughts. The inn was the heart of St. Mary Mead's gossip, a place where truths and half-truths mingled as freely as ale and cider. Its low-beamed ceiling and smoky air seemed designed to cradle secrets, and today it was alive with voices, each eager to dissect the Hargreaves affair. Miss Marple slipped inside, her diminutive figure barely noticed amid the clamor, and settled into a corner near the inglenook fireplace, where a small fire crackled despite the summer warmth. She ordered a glass of ginger beer, her eyes scanning the room with the quiet alertness of a hawk perched above a field. At a table near the bar, Tom, the undergardener from Elmhurst, held court, his cap pushed back, and his freckled face animated with the thrill of being the center of attention. "I tell you, I saw him that very afternoon," he declared, his voice carrying to Miss Marple's corner. Mr. Hargreaves, pacing the rose garden like a caged beast, muttering to himself. "It's all a lie," he said, clear as day. Looked proper haunted, he did, his eyes wild as if he'd seen a ghost. And Mrs. Hargreaves? "Off to London again last week, so I heard. Shopping, she says, but for what? Silk dresses or secrets, I reckon." A chorus of murmurs greeted this, punctuated by the clink of tankards. Mr. Polk, the butcher, leaned forward, his apron stained with the day's work. "That's not all. My lad delivered chops to Elmhurst 2 days before, and Mrs. Cook was in a right state, muttering about omens and crossing herself over that haddock. Said it was St. Peter's mark, a blessing, but her hands were shaking like she'd seen the devil himself." Miss Marple sipped her ginger beer, her expression one of mild interest, but her mind was a whirl of connections. Tom's tale of Reginald's agitation suggested a man wrestling with a private torment, financial ruin, perhaps, or a betrayal closer to home. And Mrs. Cook's superstition about the haddock's thumb mark intrigued her. Was it merely the fear of a simple woman, or had someone planted the idea to divert attention from a more calculated act? She recalled a case in Saint Honoré years ago, where a cook's obsession with a cursed pie had masked a dose of digitalis slipped into the pastry. Symbols, she knew, could be as deceptive as alibis. She rose, her movements deliberate, and approached the bar, where Mrs. Weatherby, the innkeeper's wife, polished glasses with a vigor that suggested she was scrubbing away the village's sins. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Weatherby," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but carrying a note of purpose. "Such a sad business at Elmhurst. I suppose everyone's talking of it." Mrs. Weatherby's eyes gleamed with the eagerness of one who thrived on news. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's all anyone can speak of. Food poisoning, they say. But there's queer talk. Some reckon Mr. Hargreaves was driven mad. Jealousy, maybe, over Mrs. Hargreaves's trips to town. She's been seen posting letters to a Mr. Forbes, you know, a solicitor, but folks say he's more than that, and young Lydia Trent, always skulking about with those medicine bottles. Makes you wonder what she was mixing for the poor man." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, the kind that invited confidences without betraying her own thoughts. "Lydia does seem devoted to her uncle, though nursing can be such a delicate task. Medicines are so potent these days. I believe Mr. Hargreaves used eye drops for his glaucoma." Mrs. Weatherby nodded, leaning closer. "Aye, that's what Mr. Pettigrew at the chemist's said. Pilocarpine, it's called. Strong stuff, he told me, and Mr. Hargreaves was particular about it. But here's the thing. Mrs. Hargreaves bought some, too, a month back. Said it was for her own eyes, but Pettigrew thought it odd. Her eyes look sharp as a cat's to me." This was a new thread, and Miss Marple's fingers itched to weave it into the pattern forming in her mind. Pilocarpine, when misused, could produce symptoms chillingly similar to those described: excessive salivation, convulsions, a delirium that might be mistaken for madness. Had Eliza procured extra to tamper with her husband's dose? Or was Lydia, with her nursing training and access to the drops, concealing a darker motive? Debts, perhaps? Or a resentment nurtured in the shadow of her uncle's wealth? Leaving the inn, Miss Marple made her way to Mr. Pettigrew's chemist shop, a small establishment smelling of lavender and carbolic. The old man, with his wire-rimmed glasses and air of quiet authority, greeted her warmly. "Miss Marple, a pleasure. Come for your rosewater, or is it something else today?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling with disarming innocence. "Just a small matter, Mr. Pettigrew. I was thinking of poor Mr. Hargreaves and his eye troubles. You supplied his pilocarpine, I believe?" Pettigrew's face clouded. "Aye, poor soul. Regular prescription, carefully measured. He was in a week ago, looking peaky, asking if the drops could muddle the mind. I assured him they couldn't, not in proper doses." "And Mrs. Hargreaves?" Miss Marple's tone was light, as if she were merely passing the time. "She purchased some as well, I hear?" Pettigrew hesitated, his fingers adjusting a jar of lozenges. "She did, yes, said it was for dry eyes, though I'd not heard her complain of such before. Insisted on a separate bottle, not to mix with his. Paid in cash, which was unusual. She usually runs an account." Miss Marple thanked him and stepped back into the street, her mind alight with possibilities. The separate bottle suggested premeditation. Why else avoid the household account? She thought of Eliza's composed demeanor at Elmhurst, her swift retrieval of the crumpled envelope with its London postmark. Arthur Forbes, the solicitor, loomed larger in the puzzle. Was he a lover, a conspirator, or merely a red herring cast by village gossip? As she walked home, passing the church where the vicar was pruning roses, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the haddock supper. Mrs. Cook's insistence on its freshness, coupled with Eliza's choice of the dish, felt deliberate, like a stage direction in a carefully scripted play. The thumb mark of St. Peter was a picturesque detail, but Miss Marple suspected it served as a distraction, much like the embroidered tablecloths that hid stains in less scrupulous households. Poison in the fish would have been too obvious, too easily detected. No, the method was subtler, perhaps in the eye drops administered nightly, where an overdose could accumulate unnoticed until it struck with fatal force. At Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the storm brewing in her mind. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once dismissed village life as dull. "Dull, my dear?" she had countered. "Human nature is never dull. It's like a quiet pond, smooth on top, but teeming with life beneath." And beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead, something venomous stirred. She decided to telephone Sir Henry Clithering, her old friend from Scotland Yard, now retired but ever eager for a puzzle. Dialing from the hall, she caught him just as he was finishing a late lunch. "Henry, it's Jane Marple. I need your ear for a moment. This Hargreaves business, food poisoning, they say, but the symptoms suggest otherwise. Convulsions, ravings. It's rather like that case you told me about, the diplomat who overdosed on his heart medicine. Could pilocarpine do the same?" Sir Henry's chuckle crackled through the line. "Jane, you're at it again, aren't you? Pilocarpine in excess could indeed mimic poisoning, sweating, frothing, delirium. Hard to detect unless you're looking for it. Inspector Craddock's on the case, I hear. Want me to nudge him?" "Not yet," Miss Marple said. "But do find out if he's testing for anything beyond Maine. And this Mr. Forbes, Any chance you know him? A solicitor, I'm told, with a connection to Mrs. Hargreaves. I'll poke around, Sir Henry promised. But Jane, be careful. If it's murder, someone's playing a clever game. As she hung up, Miss Marple's gaze fell on her garden, where Cherry was pinning laundry with brisk efficiency. The ordinariness of it all contrasted sharply with the darkness she sensed at Elmhurst. She thought of Lydia's trembling hands, Eliza's guarded eyes, and the envelope marked AF motives were taking shape. Greed, for Reginald's estate, was substantial. Love, if Forbes was more than a solicitor. Or perhaps fear, if Reginald had uncovered a secret that threatened to unravel his wife's carefully curated life. The village clock struck 5, and Miss Marple rose to prepare for evensong, her mind still weaving its delicate web. The whispers of St. Mary Mead were like threads in a tapestry, each one vital to the whole. She would follow them, through the inn's chatter, the chemist's hesitations, and the silent clues of Elmhurst, until the pattern of truth emerged. For now, the thumb mark of St. Peter was a riddle, but Miss Marple knew that even saints could cast shadows when human hands turned their blessings to curses. Chapter 4. The Inquest's Puzzle. The village hall of St. Mary Mead, with its faded green shutters and creaking wooden floor, was transformed into a theater of suspense on the morning of the inquest into Reginald Hargreaves's death. The air was thick with the scent of polished oak and nervous anticipation, as villagers packed the benches like spectators at a county fair, their whispers buzzing like flies over a picnic. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long rectangles of light that seemed to accuse the shadows lurking in the corners. Miss Jane Marple sat unobtrusively at the back, her black lace gloves folded neatly in her lap, her eyes as sharp as the knitting needles tucked in her reticule. She had attended many inquests in her long life, and she knew them to be less about truth than about the performance of truth. Each witness a player, each testimony a script that might conceal as much as it revealed. The coroner, Mr. Giles Rutherford, a gaunt man with a face like a weathered tombstone, presided with the gravity of one, accustomed to sifting through life's grimmer residues. His pince-nez glinted as he called the proceedings to order, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a scythe through grass. "We are here to ascertain the cause of death of Mr. Reginald Hargreaves, late of Elmhurst," he intoned. "Let us proceed with precision and respect." First to testify was Dr. Haydock, the village physician, whose ruddy cheeks and disheveled hair suggested a man harried by the demands of his profession. He adjusted his tie nervously as he took the stand, his notes clutched like a talisman. "I was summoned to Elmhurst at approximately 1 in the morning," he began, his voice steady but tinged with regret. "Mr. Hargreaves was in extremis when I arrived, convulsing violently, his face flushed, his breathing labored. There was excessive salivation, and his pupils were markedly constricted. He was incoherent, muttering phrases. Betrayed, shadows, all lies, before lapsing into unconsciousness. Despite my efforts, he expired within the hour." The coroner leaned forward, his pen poised. "And your initial diagnosis, doctor?" "Ptomaine poisoning, most likely," Haydock replied. The symptoms were consistent with severe food poisoning, possibly from the haddock consumed at supper. However, the post-mortem revealed no typical bacterial toxins, which is unusual. The stomach contents showed only the remnants of fish, potatoes, and peas, with no clear evidence of contamination. A ripple of murmurs swept the room, and Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. No toxins? That ruled out the simpler culprits, but not the more insidious ones. Pilocarpine, she knew from a long-ago conversation with a chemist friend, could mimic such symptoms: sweating, convulsions, pinpoint pupils, and might evade detection unless specifically sought. She made a mental note to ask Sir Henry Clithering if the police had tested for it. And the ravings? Mr. Rutherford pressed, his voice sharp. Could they indicate a mental collapse, perhaps precipitating a suicidal act? Dr. Haydock hesitated, his fingers twisting the edge of his notes. It's possible, sir. Delirium can accompany severe poisoning, but his words suggested distress beyond physical pain. I cannot rule out a psychological component, though I saw no prior signs of mental instability in Mr. Hargreaves. The room buzzed louder, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The suggestion of madness was a convenient cloak, one that could shroud murder in the guise of self-destruction. She recalled a case in her youth where a woman's hysteria was revealed as strychnine poisoning orchestrated by a greedy nephew. Human nature, she reflected, loved to label the inexplicable as madness. It saved the trouble of digging deeper. Next came Mrs. Cook, the Hargreaves' cook, a stout woman with a face like a worried apple, her hands clasped tightly as if to ward off evil spirits. She wore a starched apron, and her voice trembled as she spoke. I prepared the supper myself, sir. Fresh haddock, delivered that morning from the coast. It had the thumb mark, you know, St. Peter's own, a sign of blessing. I cooked it in butter with potatoes and peas, simple as you like. Mr. Hargreaves ate heartily. Mrs. Hargreaves took only a few bites. There was nothing wrong with that fish, I swear it on my mother's grave. The coroner's gaze was unyielding. And you're certain no one tampered with the meal, Mrs. Cook? She crossed herself, her eyes darting to the ceiling. No one, sir. I served it straight from the pan to the table. The kitchen was locked after, as always. But Mrs. Hargreaves chose the haddock special-like. Said it was Mr. Hargreaves's favorite, though I don't recall him asking for it. Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if reaching for an invisible thread. Eliza's insistence on the haddock was a curious detail, one that might point to a deliberate misdirection. The thumb mark, with its saintly lore, was a perfect distraction, picturesque enough to draw attention from a less obvious method, like tampered medicine. She glanced at Eliza, seated in the front row, her black mourning dress impeccable, her face a mask of composed sorrow. Too composed, perhaps, for a woman who had watched her husband die in agony. Eliza was called next, and she rose with the grace of a stage actress, her auburn hair catching the light as she took the stand. Her voice was clear, almost musical, as she recounted the evening. Reginald and I dined alone, as we often did. He seemed in good spirits, though he'd been worried about some investments lately. Bank shares, I believe. The haddock was delicious, and he ate with appetite. I wasn't very hungry myself. Later I retired early, but I was woken by his cries. He was thrashing, gasping, saying terrible things about betrayal, about being watched. I called for Lydia and sent for Dr. Haydock, but it was too late. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, a performance so flawless that the room seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple, however, noted the precision of her words, as if rehearsed. Betrayal, she thought. Had Reginald sensed a plot, or was Eliza planting the seed of madness to deflect suspicion? And your husband's mental state? the coroner asked. Any signs of instability before this? Eliza's lips parted in a faint sigh. He was under strain, as I said. Business matters weighed on him. But madness? No, sir. Reginald was the sanest man I knew. If he spoke of betrayal, it was the delirium of his final moments. The room murmured again, and Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Lydia Trent, who sat hunched in a pew, her hands twisting a damp handkerchief. When called to the stand, the girl moved as if under a spell, her gray eyes wide with something akin to fear. I was in my room when it happened, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I heard Uncle's screams and ran to him. He was horrible to see, clutching his throat, his eyes staring like he saw something awful. I tried to help, but he pushed me away, shouting about lies and shadows. I didn't know what to do. And you administered his eye drops, I understand? Mr. Rutherford's tone was gentle but probing. For his glaucoma? Lydia nodded, her fingers tightening on the handkerchief. Yes, sir. Pilocarpine, twice daily. I was careful, always measured exactly. He trusted me with it. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her mind racing. Lydia's nervousness was palpable, but was it guilt or merely the strain of the moment? The drops were a perfect vehicle for poison. Administered nightly, a subtle increase could build to a lethal dose, leaving little trace unless specifically tested for. And Eliza's own purchase of pilocarpine, as Mr. Pettigrew had revealed, suggested a chilling possibility. A wife orchestrating a murder with clinical precision. The coroner called Inspector Craddock next, a youngish man with a square jaw and a no-nonsense air that Miss Marple found reassuring, if a trifle unimaginative. He reported the police findings. The haddock remnants, tested at the county lab, showed no trace of common poisons, arsenic, strychnine, or bacterial toxins. We're awaiting further analysis, he said, but at present there's no evidence of foul play in the food itself. The symptoms suggest poisoning, but the source is unclear. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, and Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. The absence of poison in the fish was no surprise. It was too obvious a method, too easily traced. The real clue lay in the symptoms, so precisely described by Dr. Haydock: constricted pupils, salivation, convulsions. Pilocarpine, she thought, could explain it all, its effects masquerading as food poisoning or madness. But who had the motive and the opportunity? As the inquest drew to a close, Mr. Rutherford delivered a provisional verdict: death by misadventure, pending further investigation. The cause remains uncertain, he said, but we cannot rule out accidental poisoning or a natural collapse exacerbated by stress. The police will continue their inquiries. The villagers filed out, their voices rising in a crescendo of speculation. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes scanning the room as Eliza comforted Lydia, her hand resting lightly on the girl's shoulder, a gesture that seemed more possessive than consoling. She thought of the crumpled envelope she'd glimpsed at Elmhurst, addressed to Eliza in a bold hand, and the book on St. Peter, open as if to taunt her with its symbolism. The thumb mark was a distraction, she was certain, but the real mark, the mark of betrayal, was hidden in the human heart. Outside, she encountered Dolly Bantry, who was practically vibrating with excitement. Jane, wasn't it thrilling? Like something out of a novel. Madness, poison, secrets. What do you make of it? Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her voice mild, but her eyes alight. It's a puzzle, Dolly, like a jigsaw with half the pieces turned upside down. But there's a pattern, if one looks closely. Like Mrs. Carter's embroidery, all those tangled threads on the back, but turn it over, and there's a picture clear as day. Dolly laughed. "You're incorrigible, Jane. I suppose you've already solved it." "Not solved," Miss Marple said, her smile enigmatic. "But I'm beginning to see the shape of things. Human nature, you know. It's like a village lane, full of twists, but it always leads somewhere." As she walked home, the evening air cool against her cheeks, Miss Marple's mind churned with possibilities. Eliza's composure, Lydia's fear, the missing poison in the fish, all pointed to a method both subtle and deliberate. She thought of Arthur Forbes, the solicitor whose name hovered like a specter over the case. Was he Eliza's ally in a plot for freedom and wealth, or merely a convenient scapegoat for village gossip? And Lydia, her devotion to her uncle seemed genuine, but devotion could mask resentment, especially in a young woman trapped in a subservient role. At Danemead Cottage, Miss Marple lit a small fire and settled into her armchair, her knitting a soft rhythm against the silence. She would write to Sir Henry Clithering tonight, urging him to press Craddock on the pilocarpine tests. The inquest had raised more questions than it answered, but that was often the way of things. Truth, like a shy creature, hid in the underbrush, waiting for a patient hand to flush it out. And Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, was nothing if not patient. Chapter 5. A Visit from Sir Henry. The twilight settled over St. Mary Mead like a velvet curtain, softening the edges of the village's thatched roofs and casting long shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. At Danemead Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat in her cozy sitting room, the glow of a single lamp illuminating her knitting, which lay forgotten in her lap. The air was fragrant with the scent of lavender from a bowl on the mantel, and the faint tick of the grandfather clock marked the passage of a day that had been anything but ordinary. The inquest into Reginald Hargreaves' death had left more questions than answers, and Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of threads, each a clue, each a potential path to the truth. The haddock's thumb mark, Lydia's trembling hands, Eliza's composed facade, and the elusive Mr. Forbes all danced in her thoughts like figures in a village pageant, each playing a role yet to be fully understood. A sharp rap at the door broke her reverie, and Cherry, her young maid, ushered in Sir Henry Clithering, retired Commissioner of Scotland Yard, and one of Miss Marple's most trusted confidants. His tall frame filled the doorway, his silver hair catching the lamplight, and his eyes twinkled with the anticipation of a puzzle worth solving. "Jane, you old sleuth," he said, settling into the chintz armchair opposite her. "I knew you'd be up to your neck in this Hargreaves business. Craddock's tearing his hair out, and I'm not surprised. Food poisoning without poison, ravings of madness. It's got all the makings of one of your village conundrums." Miss Marple smiled, her hands reaching for the teapot with the practiced grace of a hostess who knew the value of a well-timed pause. "Dear Henry, you do flatter me, but it's not my conundrum. It's St. Mary Mead's. Tea? Or perhaps something stronger? I've a bottle of damson gin from last autumn. Quite respectable, I'm told." Sir Henry chuckled, accepting a cup of tea. "Tea will do for now, though I may need that gin if this case gets any murkier. Craddock's report is a muddle. No toxins in the fish, symptoms that don't quite add up, and a village buzzing with talk of insanity. What's your take, Jane?" You've been poking about, I'll wager." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles, her voice soft but laced with purpose. "Poking about? Hardly, Henry. I merely listen, and people do love to talk. The inquest was most illuminating, not for what it revealed, but for what it concealed. Reginald Hargreaves's symptoms, convulsions, salivation, constricted pupils, point to something more specific than ptomaine. Pilocarpine, perhaps, from his glaucoma drops. In excess, it could mimic poisoning or even madness, you know. I recall a case in Saint-Honoré years ago where a chemist's error led to a fatal overdose. The victim raved like a lunatic before the end." Sir Henry leaned forward, his cup forgotten. "Pilocarpine, eh? That's a devilish thought. Hard to detect unless you're looking for it, and Craddock's lot haven't tested for it yet. But who'd have the means? And the motive? Eliza Hargreaves, I presume? She's the obvious suspect, with those London trips and that solicitor fellow, Forbes." Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile, the kind that suggested she was several steps ahead, but too polite to say so. "Eliza is certainly interesting, Henry. So composed, so careful. At Elmhurst I saw a letter, addressed to her from an AF in London. She whisked it away, but not before I noted the intimacy of the script, and her insistence on the haddock supper when she barely ate it herself. It's like a play with a carefully chosen prop, the thumb mark of St. Peter, a distraction to make us look at the fish and not elsewhere." Sir Henry's eyebrows rose. "You think she poisoned the drops, or had someone else do it?" "Not so fast," Miss Marple said, pouring herself another cup. "There's Lydia Trent to consider, the niece, so quiet, so nervous. She administered Reginald's drops, trained as a nurse, no less. Her hands shook at Elmhurst, and her eyes darted like a cornered creature's. Guilt? Fear? Or merely grief? And then there's Mrs. Cook, the cook, who swears the haddock was fresh, but admitted Eliza chose it. It's all so neatly arranged, Henry, like a pattern in my knitting, beautiful on the surface, but turn it over, and the threads are a tangle." Sir Henry sipped his tea, his mind racing. "Motive, then? Money? Eliza inherits, I presume. Craddock's checking the will. Or love? This Forbes chap? Any chance he's more than a solicitor?" Miss Marple's fingers twitched, as if reaching for an invisible clue. "Possibly both. Reginald's estate is substantial. Elmhurst alone is worth a fortune. And Forbes, Dolly Bantry mentioned him as a gentleman friend, though she's prone to embellishment. I'd wager he's tied to Eliza's London trips. A solicitor with a personal interest could be dangerous, especially if Reginald suspected an affair. His ravings, betrayed. Shadows, suggest he knew something, or thought he did." Sir Henry nodded, his expression grim. "Craddock's digging into Forbes. He's based in Lincoln's Inn, handles the Hargreaves affairs. No record of scandal, but that means little. What about Lydia? Any reason she'd turn on her uncle?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. "Lydia's a puzzle. She's dependent on the Hargreaves, living in their shadow. I heard at the post office that she's been asking for loans. Small sums, but frequent. Reginald refused her once, quite sharply, Mrs. Price said. Resentment can fester, Henry, especially in a young woman with no prospects. And her nursing knowledge, she'd know exactly how much pilocarpine could kill without raising suspicion." The room fell silent, save for the clock's steady tick. Outside, the village was settling into evening, the distant bleat of sheep mingling with the soft coo of doves. Miss Marple's mind, however, was far from peaceful. She thought of the book on St. Peter at Elmhurst, open as if to taunt her with its symbolism. The thumb mark was a red herring, she was certain, but the real poison lay elsewhere, perhaps in the drops, perhaps in a cup of tea or a glass of wine served with a smile. Human nature, she reflected, was like a garden, cultivated on the surface, but dig a little, and you found the roots of malice. "Henry," she said suddenly, "do ask Craddock to test the medicine bottles at Elmhurst. Not just Reginald's drops, but any others. Eliza bought pilocarpine for herself," Mr. Pettigrew said. "If she mixed a stronger dose, it could have been slipped into his routine without Lydia noticing." Sir Henry's eyes widened. "Clever, Jane. You think she framed the niece?" "Not framed, perhaps," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but incisive, "but used her. Lydia's the perfect tool, devoted, trusting, and unlikely to question, like poor Miss Carter in the village, who never suspected her sister's tonic was laced with laudanum. People underestimate the quiet ones, Henry, but they're often the key." Sir Henry set down his cup, his expression a mix of admiration and exasperation. "You're a marvel, Jane. I'll call Craddock tonight. Anything else I should know?" Miss Marple hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window, where the last light of day painted the garden in shades of indigo. "Just one thing. At the inquest, Eliza said Reginald was worried about investments, but Tom, the gardener, heard him muttering about lies, not money, and his ravings, betrayed. All lies. They weren't random. He knew something, Henry, something that cost him his life. Find out what Forbes was, handling for them. It might be the knot that unravels the whole skein." Sir Henry rose, his smile wry. "I'll do that. But Jane, you're playing a dangerous game. If it's murder, someone's watching, and they won't like your meddling." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I'm just a harmless old spinster, Henry. Who'd notice me? But do be quick. The truth has a way of slipping through one's fingers, like sand." As Sir Henry took his leave, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking with renewed purpose. The visit had clarified her suspicions, but the puzzle was far from complete. Eliza's composure, Lydia's fear, Forbes's shadowy presence, all were pieces in a game where the stakes were life and death. She thought of a long-ago case in St. Mary Mead, where a wife's secret lover had poisoned her husband with a smile, only to be undone by a single, careless letter. History, she knew, had a way of repeating itself, and she would be ready when it did. The evening deepened, and Miss Marple lit another lamp, her mind turning over the clues like a jeweler examining facets of a stone. She would visit the vicarage tomorrow, where Mrs. Clement might have heard more about Lydia's debts, and she would keep an eye on Tom, whose loose tongue might yet reveal more than he intended. For now, she let the rhythm of her knitting soothe her, each stitch a step closer to the truth. In St. Mary Mead, secrets were like weeds, persistent, but not impossible to uproot, if one knew where to dig. Chapter 6. The Garden's Secrets. The late afternoon sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, its rays filtering through the ancient elms that lined the lane to Elmhurst, casting dappled patterns on the ground, like clues scattered for the observant. Miss Jane Marple, her black shawl draped elegantly over her shoulders, and her straw hat adorned with a modest sprig of heather, walked with a purposeful tread, her umbrella tapping a rhythm that belied her frail appearance. She had been invited back to Elmhurst by Eliza Hargreaves, ostensibly for tea, but Miss Marple suspected the invitation was a performance, a widow's attempt to maintain the facade of normalcy while the village buzzed with suspicion. Her visit with Sir Henry Clithering the previous evening had sharpened her focus, and she was determined to unearth the secrets that Elmhurst's manicured gardens and polished interiors concealed. The house stood as imposing as ever, its red brick walls softened by ivy that seemed to cling with a possessive tenacity. The gardens were a symphony of order, rose beds clipped with surgical precision, a gravel path winding like a narrative thread, and a small pergola draped with clematis, its blooms heavy with the scent of summer. Yet as Miss Marple approached, she noticed a subtle discord, a patch of disturbed earth near a lavender bush, as if someone had knelt there in haste, and a single rose petal, bruised and out of place, lying on the path. Details, she knew, were the breadcrumbs of truth, and she tucked these away in her mind's meticulous catalogue. The door was opened by the same nervous maid, her apron slightly askew, her eyes darting as if expecting a spectre to follow Miss Marple inside. "Mrs. Hargreaves is in the conservatory, miss," she murmured, leading the way through a hall where the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old roses. A grandfather clock ticked solemnly, its pendulum a reminder of time's relentless march, and Miss Marple noted a small brass key on a side table, its presence oddly incongruous amid the polished order. Was it for a desk, a cupboard, or something more clandestine? In the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with ferns and orchids, Eliza Hargreaves awaited, her black morning dress a stark contrast to the vibrant greenery. She rose with a smile that was both gracious and brittle, like porcelain on the verge of cracking. "Miss Marple, how delightful to see you again," she said, gesturing to a wicker chair cushioned with floral chintz. "I thought the conservatory would be a pleasant change. So soothing, don't you find?" "Quite charming," Miss Marple replied, settling herself with a view of the garden beyond the glass. "It's like a little Eden, though I dare say even Eden had its secrets. Your husband must have loved it here." Eliza's fingers tightened briefly on her teacup, a flicker of unease crossing her face before she smoothed it away. "Reginald did enjoy it, yes. He'd sit here with his books, especially in his last months, when his eyes made reading difficult. The light was kinder here." Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, noted the careful choice of words. Reginald's glaucoma, treated with pilocarpine drops, was a thread she had been tugging at since her first visit. An overdose could explain his symptoms: convulsions, salivation, delirium mistaken for madness. But who had the opportunity and the motive to tamper with his medicine? Eliza, with her composed demeanor and mysterious London trips, was the obvious suspect. Yet Lydia Trent's nervous silences suggested another possibility. "His eyes troubled him greatly, I understand," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but probing. "Those drops, pilocarpine, wasn't it? Such a delicate balance." Eliza nodded, her expression serene. "Lydia managed them. She's so meticulous, trained as a nurse, you know. Reginald trusted her implicitly." As if summoned by her name, Lydia appeared, her gray dress blending with the shadows of the conservatory. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and her hands clutched a small embroidered handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. "Miss Marple," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I hope you're well." "Quite well, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone warm but her gaze keen. "Though I confess, this sad business weighs on us all. You were so devoted to your uncle, tending to his needs. It must be a comfort to know you did all you could." Lydia's lips trembled, and she sank into a chair, her eyes avoiding Eliza's. I tried, his drops. I measured them exactly, morning and evening. He was particular about it. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind racing. Lydia's nervousness was palpable, but was it guilt, fear, or the strain of grief? The drops were a perfect vehicle for poison. Administered daily, a subtle increase could kill without immediate suspicion. Yet Eliza's own purchase of pilocarpine, as Mr. Pettigrew had confided, suggested a chilling alternative. A wife orchestrating a murder with clinical precision, perhaps using Lydia as an unwitting accomplice. "Shall we take a turn in the garden?" Miss Marple suggested, sensing the conservatory's air growing heavy with unspoken tensions. "The roses are so splendid, and I find a stroll sharpens one's perspective." Eliza hesitated, her eyes flickering to Lydia, but she agreed, leading the way through a side door to the terrace. The garden was a masterpiece of design, its paths lined with lavender, and its borders ablaze with marigolds and dahlias. Miss Marple walked slowly, her umbrella tapping the gravel, her eyes scanning for anomalies. She noticed Tom, the young gardener, pruning a hedge with exaggerated care, his cap pulled low as if to shield himself from scrutiny. "Your gardens are a marvel," she said to Eliza. "Did Mr. Hargreaves spend much time here, despite his troubles?" "He did," Eliza replied, her voice tinged with a note that might have been regret or artifice. "He loved the solitude, though lately he was distracted. He'd pace the paths, muttering to himself. I thought it was his investments, but perhaps it was more." Miss Marple paused by a bed of roses, their scarlet petals vivid against the green. "Distraction can be telling," she said, her tone light. "I recall poor Mrs. Fowler, who paced her garden when her husband's suspicions drove her to despair. Gardens, you know, are like confessionals. They hear everything, if one listens." Eliza's smile was strained, and Lydia, trailing behind, flinched as if the words had struck a nerve. Miss Marple's gaze fell on a small stone bench tucked beneath a willow, its surface marred by a faint stain. Ink, perhaps, or something less innocent. She made a mental note to inquire about it later, perhaps through Tom, whose loose tongue at the Blue Boar had already proven useful. As they approached the kitchen garden, Miss Marple requested a word with Mrs. Cook, citing a sudden fancy for her recipe for lemon drizzle cake. Eliza's eyes narrowed briefly, but she nodded, directing the maid to fetch the cook. Mrs. Cook appeared, her face flushed from the heat of the stove, her silver cross glinting at her throat. "Miss Marple," she said, wiping flour from her hands. "It's a kindness to visit, though. I'm in no state for company, what with this awful business." "Nonsense, Mrs. Cook," Miss Marple said, settling onto a bench by the herb garden. "Your cooking is the talk of the village, and I'm sure that haddock was perfection itself. You prepared it, I believe?" "Aye, miss," Mrs. Cook said, her voice firm but her eyes darting to the house. "Fresh as the morning tide, with St. Peter's thumb mark clear as day. I cooked it in butter, served it hot with potatoes and peas. Mr. Hargreaves ate heartily. Mrs. Hargreaves barely touched hers. Said her appetite was off." Miss Marple's lips curved in a gentle smile. "And it was Mrs. Hargreaves who chose the dish?" Mrs. Cook nodded, her fingers twisting her apron. "She did, miss. Insisted it was his favorite, though I'd not heard him ask for it in ages. I thought it odd, but she's the mistress, isn't she?" The cook's words were a spark in Miss Marple's mind, igniting a suspicion that had been smoldering since her first visit. Eliza's choice of the haddock, coupled with her minimal consumption, suggested a deliberate misdirection. The thumb mark a picturesque distraction to draw eyes from the true method of murder. Pilocarpine, she thought, could have been slipped into Reginald's drops, perhaps even his tea or wine, its effects building over days until they struck with fatal force. Returning to the conservatory, Miss Marple's eyes caught a new detail. A small writing desk in a corner, its surface cluttered with papers and a single ink bottle, its cap askew. Among the papers was a folded letter, its edge just visible, bearing a London postmark and the initials AF. Arthur Forbes, no doubt. Before she could comment, Eliza swept the letter into a drawer, her smile tight. "Just some old correspondence," she said. "Reginald's affairs are so complicated now." Miss Marple nodded, her expression benign but her thoughts razor-sharp. The letter confirmed Forbes's role, perhaps as more than a solicitor. Had Reginald discovered an affair, fueling his ravings of betrayal? Or was Forbes a partner in a plot for wealth, with Eliza poised to inherit Elmhurst and its riches? As tea concluded, Miss Marple lingered by the conservatory's glass doors, her gaze drifting to the garden. "Such a lovely view," she said. "Though I wonder, did Mr. Hargreaves keep a diary? So many gentlemen do, and it might shed light on his worries." Eliza's face stiffened, and Lydia's hands clenched her handkerchief. "No diary," Eliza said quickly. "He wasn't one for writing things down." Miss Marple smiled, unconvinced. A pity. Words can be such faithful witnesses. As she took her leave, the maid handed her a shawl she hadn't noticed dropping, and Miss Marple's fingers brushed a small object tucked in its folds. A vial, empty but labeled pilocarpine. Her heart quickened, but she slipped it into her reticule without a word. Her face a mask of innocence. Back at Danemead Cottage, she would examine it closely, perhaps with Sir Henry's help. For now, she walked down the drive, her umbrella tapping a rhythm of resolve, the garden's secrets whispering in her wake. Chapter 7. The Final Thread. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, as if the village itself sensed the gathering storm of revelation. At Danemead Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat by her hearth, the fire's soft glow casting flickering shadows on the walls, each one a silent echo of the secrets she had uncovered. Her knitting lay idle, the pink wool coiled like a dormant serpent, for her mind was too engrossed to spare a thought for stitches. The vial of pilocarpine, discovered in the folds of her shawl after her visit to Elmhurst, rested on the side table, its empty glass glinting with the promise of truth. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, yet Miss Marple knew that small things often unraveled the grandest schemes. The Hargreaves case, with its layers of deception, was drawing to a close, and she felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle nearing its solution. The day had been one of quiet but relentless pursuit. After her garden stroll at Elmhurst, where the disturbed earth and bruised rose petal had whispered of hidden actions, Miss Marple had spent the afternoon piecing together the fragments of evidence. The inquest had confirmed no poison in the haddock, ruling out the thumb mark of St. Peter as anything more than a picturesque distraction. Sir Henry Clithering's visit had sharpened her suspicions about pilocarpine, a drug that could mimic madness while killing with silent efficiency. Eliza Hargreaves's composed demeanor, Lydia Trent's nervous silences, and the shadow of Arthur Forbes, the solicitor with a suspiciously intimate letter, formed a tapestry of motive and opportunity. But it was the vial, unlabeled save for its chemical name, tucked where it might have been dropped in haste, that tipped the balance from suspicion to certainty. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Inspector Craddock, his square jaw set with determination, and Sir Henry, whose eyes gleamed with anticipation. They had agreed to meet at Miss Marple's cottage before confronting the household at Elmhurst, a strategy she had proposed with the gentle insistence of one who knew the value of a well-timed denouement. "Jane, you've got that look," Sir Henry said, settling into the armchair with a grin. "Like a cat who's spotted the cream. What's this about a vial?" Miss Marple's smile was demure, but her eyes were alight with purpose. "Patience, Henry. First, let's have tea. It's such a civilizing ritual, don't you think? Inspector, do sit down. You've been busy, I trust?" Craddock, ever practical, nodded brusquely. "Busy, yes, but confounded. The lab results came in this afternoon. No common poisons in Hargreaves's system, but we're still waiting on the exotic ones. The haddock's clean, as we thought. Those symptoms, convulsions, salivation, pinpoint pupils, don't add up to ptomaine. Sir Henry mentioned pilocarpine. We've sent the medicine bottles from Elmhurst for testing, but it'll take time." Miss Marple poured tea with deliberate calm, her hands steady as her mind raced. "Time is a luxury we may not have, Inspector. People talk, and murderers grow bold when they think they've escaped notice. I found something at Elmhurst yesterday, a small vial, empty, labeled pilocarpine. It was tucked in my shawl, as if dropped by accident. Curious, don't you think, for a household already supplied with Reginald's prescription?" Sir Henry's eyebrows shot up. "Good Lord, Jane, you're a magnet for clues. Dropped by whom? Eliza? Lydia?" "That," Miss Marple said, handing him a cup, "is what we must discover, but let me share a theory. Pilocarpine, in excess, produces symptoms remarkably like those described: sweating, frothing, delirium. It's a perfect disguise for murder, especially if one wishes to suggest madness or suicide. Eliza Hargreaves, with her London trips and that letter from AF, has motive. Aplenty, wealth, freedom, perhaps a lover. But Lydia, with her nursing training and access to the drops, could be an unwitting tool or a cunning accomplice." Craddock frowned, his notebook open. "You're saying Eliza poisoned her husband, but used Lydia to deliver the dose?" "Possibly," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but incisive. "Or Lydia acted alone, driven by desperation. I heard at the post office that she's been borrowing money, small sums, but frequent. Reginald refused her once, quite publicly. Resentment can fester, Inspector, like a weed in a garden. But my instinct points to Eliza. Her composure is too perfect, her answers too rehearsed. And that letter, Arthur Forbes is no mere solicitor, I suspect." Sir Henry leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Forbes checks out. Lincoln's Inn, solid reputation, handles the Hargreaves estate. But I dug deeper, as you asked. He's been seen with Eliza in London. Dinners, theater, nothing overt, but cozy enough to raise eyebrows. And the will? Eliza inherits everything. Elmhurst, the investments, the lot. No provision for Lydia, which seems harsh." Miss Marple's lips pursed, her mind weaving the threads into a tighter pattern. Harsh, indeed. A motive for Lydia, perhaps, but Eliza's the one with the means. She bought extra pilocarpine, Mr. Pettigrew said, for dry eyes. A flimsy excuse for a woman with no history of eye trouble. Suppose she strengthened Reginald's drops, or slipped it into his tea. The haddock was a distraction, its thumb mark a convenient myth to mask the truth. Craddock scribbled furiously, his skepticism softening. "It fits, Miss Marple, but we need proof. The vial's a start, but fingerprints are unlikely. It's been handled too much. If the lab confirms pilocarpine in Hargreaves's system, we'll have a case." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Then let's not wait, Inspector. Gather the household at Elmhurst tonight. A little pressure can loosen tongues, and I believe we're close to the final thread." The evening found them at Elmhurst, the drawing room aglow with lamplight that failed to warm the chill of suspicion. Eliza sat erect, her black dress a study in controlled elegance, while Lydia hovered near the fireplace, her hands twisting a handkerchief into knots. Mrs. Cook stood by the door, her face pale but resolute, and Tom, the gardener, lingered awkwardly, summoned at Miss Marple's insistence. Inspector Craddock stood by the mantel, his presence official, but softened by Miss Marple's quiet authority. "Mrs. Hargreaves," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but carrying the weight of truth, "we are here to discuss your husband's death. The inquest suggested food poisoning, but the haddock was clean. His symptoms, convulsions, salivation, delirium, point to pilocarpine, a drug you both had access to. I believe you poisoned Reginald, perhaps through his eye drops, to make it look like madness or suicide. The thumb mark of St. Peter was a clever distraction, but it cannot hide the truth." Eliza's face hardened, her green eyes flashing. "That's absurd, Miss Marple. I loved my husband. Why would I harm him?" "For freedom," Miss Marple said softly. "And wealth. Your trips to London, your letters from Mr. Forbes, they suggest a life you couldn't have with Reginald. His will leaves everything to you, does it not? And his ravings. Betrayed. Lies. He knew of your plans, didn't he?" Lydia gasped, her handkerchief falling to the floor. "Aunt Eliza, no, you couldn't." Eliza's composure cracked, her voice rising. "Prove it. You've nothing but guesses, old woman." Craddock stepped forward, his voice steady. "We have more than guesses, Mrs. Hargreaves. The lab found pilocarpine in your husband's blood, far beyond his prescription. And his medicine bottle? Tampered with, a higher concentration than ordered. Then there's this." He held up the vial from Miss Marple's shawl, its glass catching the light. "Found at Elmhurst, empty but recently used." Mrs. Cook's hand flew to her cross, and Tom shifted uneasily, his eyes darting to Eliza. Lydia's sob broke the silence, her voice trembling. "I didn't know. I gave him the drops as always, I swear it." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her words were firm. "You didn't know, my dear, but someone did. Mrs. Hargreaves, you bought extra pilocarpine, claiming it was for your eyes. You chose the haddock, knowing its legend would draw attention, and you spread rumors of madness, hoping to suggest suicide. But Reginald's words betrayed you. He knew of your affair with Forbes, and perhaps of your plan to inherit his fortune." Eliza's defiance crumbled, her shoulders sagging. "He was suffocating me," she whispered, "controlling, jealous, always watching. Forbes offered a new life, freedom, love. I didn't mean for it to go so far, but the drops were easy, just a little more each day." Craddock signaled to a constable, who stepped forward with handcuffs. Lydia wept, and Mrs. Cook crossed herself, muttering a prayer. Tom, wide-eyed, slipped out, no doubt to spread the tale at the Blue Boar. Miss Marple watched in silence, her heart heavy, but her mind clear. The final thread had been pulled, and the tapestry of deceit lay bare. As they left Elmhurst, Sir Henry took her arm, his voice low. "Jane, you're a wonder. How did you know?" "Human nature, Henry," she said, her smile faint. It's like a village lane, full of twists, but it always leads somewhere. Like poor Mrs. Ellis, who thought her lies would protect her. They never do. The night closed around St. Mary Mead, the stars sharp above the quiet cottages. Miss Marple walked home, her umbrella tapping a rhythm of resolution, ready for the next puzzle that the village's secrets might weave. Chapter 8. The Quiet of St. Mary Mead. The hush of early evening settled over St. Mary Mead like a sigh after a storm, the village's cottages glowing softly under the fading light, their thatched roofs gilded by the last rays of the sun. The air was cool, scented with honeysuckle and the faint tang of wood smoke, as if the village itself were exhaling the tensions of the past days. At Dana Mead Cottage, Miss Jane Marple sat in her familiar armchair, the fire in the hearth casting a warm flicker across the room, its light dancing on the polished surfaces of her modest furnishings. Her knitting, a cascade of soft lavender wool, lay in her lap, but her needles were still, for her mind was too alive with the echoes of the confrontation at Elmhurst to focus on mere stitches. The arrest of Eliza Hargreaves had sent ripples through the village, and though the case was resolved, Miss Marple knew that truth, like a garden, required tending even after the weeds were pulled. The evening before had been a crescendo of revelation. Eliza's confession, wrung from her under the weight of Miss Marple's quiet accusations and Inspector Craddock's damning evidence, had laid bare a plot as meticulous as it was malevolent. The pilocarpine vial, found in Miss Marple's shawl, had been the final thread, its empty glass a silent witness to a murder disguised as madness. Yet, as Miss Marple sipped her tea, the porcelain cup warm against her fingers, she felt no triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, tempered by the sadness of human frailty exposed. The door creaked open, and Cherry, her young maid, ushered in Sir Henry Clithering, his silver hair slightly disheveled from the evening breeze, his eyes alight with the camaraderie of a shared victory. "Jane, you incorrigible old sleuth," he said, settling into the chintz sofa with a grin that belied his years. "You've done it again. Eliza Hargreaves is in custody, and St. Mary Mead is buzzing like a hive knocked over. Craddock's singing your praises, though he'll never admit how much he relied on your nose for mischief." Miss Marple's smile was gentle, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Dear Henry, you do exaggerate. I merely pointed out a few threads, and the good inspector wove them together. Tea? Or perhaps a touch of elderberry wine? It's quite mild, I assure you." Sir Henry chuckled, accepting a glass of wine. "Tea's too tame for this evening, Jane. That was a masterstroke, finding that vial. How in blazes did you know it was at Elmhurst?" Miss Marple's fingers brushed the wool in her lap, her voice soft but laced with the precision of a needle. "I didn't know, Henry. Not at first. But at Elmhurst, during our garden stroll, I felt a weight in my shawl. Something slipped there by accident, perhaps when the maid took it from me. The vial was small, easily missed, but its label, pilocarpine, was a beacon. It was too convenient, you see, for a household already supplied with Reginald's prescription. Someone had been careless, and carelessness is the downfall of even the cleverest schemes. Sir Henry leaned forward, his glass catching the firelight. "Eliza, then. You were certain it was her, not Lydia?" "Not certain," Miss Marple corrected, her tone mild but firm. Suspicious, Eliza's composure was too perfect, like a painting with no flaws. It draws the eye to what's hidden. Her London trips, the letter from Arthur Forbes, her insistence on the haddock supper, all pointed to a woman planning a new life. And the pilocarpine she bought for dry eyes? Mr. Pettigrew's hesitation told me more than his words. She had means and motive. Henry. Wealth from Reginald's estate, freedom from a controlling husband, and perhaps love with Forbes, though I suspect his interest was as much financial as romantic. Sir Henry sipped his wine, his expression a mix of admiration and curiosity. But Lydia, she was shaking like a leaf at the inquest. I thought she might crack. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was as sharp as ever. Poor Lydia. She's a victim of circumstance, not malice. Her nervousness came from fear. Of Eliza, of her own precarious position. She administered the drops, yes, but she didn't tamper with them. Eliza used her, Henry, as a gardener uses a trellis, to support her scheme without drawing notice. Lydia's debts, her dependence on the Hargreaves, made her vulnerable, but not guilty. I saw it in her eyes at Elmhurst. Fear, not guile. Like young Miss Barton, years ago, who wept when her aunt's scheming was exposed. The fire crackled, and Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the confrontation at Elmhurst. The drawing-room had been a stage, its lamplight casting stark shadows as she laid out her case. Eliza's defiance, crumbling under the weight of the vial and Craddock's lab results, had been a study in human collapse. "He was suffocating me," she had whispered, her voice raw with desperation. Controlling every penny, every moment, Forbes promised a way out, a new beginning. The confession had been swift, almost a relief, as if the burden of deceit had grown too heavy to bear. "And Forbes?" Sir Henry asked, breaking her reverie. "Craddock's hauling him in for questioning. No proof he was complicit, but he's got some explaining to do." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. "Forbes is a shadow in this story, Henry. A solicitor with ambitions, perhaps, but not the architect of murder. Eliza acted alone, I believe, though his flattery fueled her resolve. She saw a life beyond Elmhurst, and Reginald's death was the key. The thumb mark of St. Peter was her flourish, a distraction to make us look at the fish, not the medicine." Sir Henry set down his glass, his expression serious. "You've a knack for seeing through people, Jane, but that vial? How did it end up in your shawl? Eliza wouldn't be so sloppy." Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Not Eliza, I think. The maid, perhaps, or even Tom, the gardener. He was at Elmhurst during the confrontation, hovering like a nervous sparrow. I suspect he found the vial, dropped in the garden, maybe, where I saw that disturbed earth, and slipped it into my shawl, hoping to shift suspicion. He's a talkative lad, but not above a bit of meddling. Like young Jimmy at the mill, who once hid a stolen brooch in my sewing basket, thinking it clever." Sir Henry laughed, shaking his head. "You're a marvel, Jane. Craddock's sending the vial for prints, but it's likely been wiped clean. The lab confirmed pilocarpine in Hargreaves's blood, lethal levels, far beyond his prescription. The bottle in his room was tampered with, just as you thought." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the fire, her mind replaying the scene at Elmhurst. Lydia's sobs, Mrs. Cook's whispered prayers, Tom's hasty retreat, all had played their parts in the drama. But it was Eliza's face, pale and defiant, that lingered, a portrait of ambition undone by its own excess. "Human nature, Henry," she said softly. "It's like a river, calm on the surface, but the currents run deep. Eliza thought she could control them, but no one outruns the truth." The village clock struck 8, its chime a gentle reminder of time's passage. Sir Henry rose, his smile warm. "I'll tell Craddock to keep you posted, But Jane, what's next? Another puzzle, or will you stick to your knitting? Miss Marple's laugh was soft, almost musical. Oh, there's always another puzzle, Henry. St. Mary Mead may look sleepy, but its heart beats with secrets, like Mrs. Price's jam jars, all lined up so neatly until you open one and find it's gone sour. As Sir Henry took his leave, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the needles clicking in a rhythm that mirrored her thoughts. The village would talk for weeks, of Eliza's betrayal, Lydia's tears, the thumb mark that had promised blessing but delivered death. Yet Miss Marple felt no pride, only a quiet resolve to watch and listen, for St. Mary Mead, like any garden, would always yield new weeds to uproot. The fire burned low, and she settled back, her eyes on the flames, ready for the next thread to unravel.